Yeah, sure. Do you want to
At FIDO Alliance, there are a lot of major companies that are deploying FIDO, either in the enterprise or to the consumer base, and sometimes, we hear rumors that a big company is doing it, but we haven't necessarily been in touch with them to understand what they're doing. And so we were super excited to get a speaking submission in from Mike Virginio at Wayfair. And we're super pleased to have him join us. He's coming in remotely, but he's here to talk about what Wayfair is doing within their complex enterprise environment. So Mike, do you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you guys.
Okay, take it away.
Awesome. Great. So thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Mike Virginio. I'm the Senior Corporate Security Engineering Manager here at Wayfair, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about how we went about planning for password environments and kind of going through, our thought process in that project. Just for scope, understanding like my role within Wayfair, we secure the tech stack and our corporate headquarters, our call centers, as well as our warehouses. So we're a pretty broad scope of areas and different technologies as well. Broke the talk up into 3 sections. First is getting internal alignment and how we kind of went about doing that, and how you might be able to do that. Next part is planning the technology strategy, right? So you have the buy-in, so what do you do and how do you attack that? And then last is defining success, as well as calling out some challenges we had along the way. So the first thing we did was define what we meant by passwordless. And we decided when we started this journey back in 2019, 2018 actually, we decided it was less passwords. And that means for us was starting to reduce the authentication flows where passwords were required, because at that time, especially, there wasn't quite as many options available to us from vendor or technology support standpoint. So we really were just trying to say, okay, what can we introduce to introduce the password authentication flows to targeted populations? And so we started really simple. We said, okay, how do we follow the current standards out there? So we followed NIST 863B on the rotations and strength of passwords. So basically, we started by not expiring passwords and reducing complexity in favor of length, and then checking for auditability, like auditing passwords as they get kind of entered for being weak and so on. So kind of reducing the number of times you have to go and reset your password because of rotational problems and so on. But we knew our end goal the whole time was to start using FIDO2 authenticators and for users not to know any passwords. And then the other goal we had and set up for is consolidation of new technology. So what else can we do to simplify our technology stack rather than try to implement something new that further adds complexity to our network and users? So the way we kind of sold the business was in 3 areas: IT ops, user experience, and then of course the security benefits, right? So you've probably seen a lot of stuff here at the conference in this area, so I won't go too deep into it, but Duo really outlines it well in one of their white papers on going passwordless from a few years ago. But basically, you want to reduce the burden of the password lifecycle, less password and MFA resets. We included MFA resets for us because when we were looking at the technology space, we realized that when we're providing these passwords options, you're usually providing 2 things of something you have, whether you're using like some capability within a laptop or a security key or something else. So you end up having your phone, which is the typical thing you think of for MFA, as well as this other kind of corporate provided system. So we want to be able to tackle not just password resets, but also MFAs. Because if you lose your phone, you then have to have something else to fall back on and enroll a new device with. Next part, better user experience. Google in their papers talk about faster logins. I think theirs is 4x. In our experience, it was a little less than that, but still, there's benefits, just efficiency and better use of employees' time, and of course, increased security. I'm sure you guys all know that, using passwordless options, FIDO authenticators, and so on, reduce phishing to near zero, if not zero, and also help prevent lateral movement from happening, depending where you're implementing on the network. Another part we did was we tied into our zero trust strategy. We started our zero trust journey also in 2018, and we really saw them as complementary initiatives. This is even somewhat called out in the White House recent zero trust strategy publication, where they specifically mentioned WebAuthn and MFA, which, if you're unfamiliar, WebAuthn is kind of the glue between your FIDO2 authenticator and a web browser to kind of authenticate to a service, which provides strong user authentication. And when you're talking about removing the network as a trust factor on your, in your corporate environment or wherever it might be, you also want to make sure that you're getting good user signals, ensuring that they are who they say they are, not just with a password. So it really goes nicely with your zero trust strategy. And also for us, we're using SSO as a platform, integrating that more. So I'll go into that in a little bit, but moving like identity to the perimeter, right? So these things all really work well together. So if you can, try to integrate those into your strategy. Next is, now you've kind of defined it, you got buy-in. What do you do to plan the actual technology implementation? So we started by just scoping our organization. So I mentioned we had a really broad area. So it was a bit of an intensive task to speak with people, meet with them, and so on. So you should do the same. See all the places that people log into things. You'll find that they'll largely fall into these 4 buckets. Operating system login on managed devices, web apps, right? Desktop and mobile apps. So something like a client or an app, on your iOS or Android device. Something that would be similar across those might be like a VPN or whatever, if you allow that. And then the last one being non-HTTP protocols. So things like management protocols like RDP and SSH. So we did this across our corporate headquarters and users. It includes engineers, infrastructure people, as well as just business users, our warehouse sites, which are particularly unique comparatively to the other 2, which is also the call center. Like our call centers have a lot of shifts, our warehouses have a lot of shifts. So there's a lot of things we want to share computers and specific kind of applications and mobile use cases there. I'll cover a little bit more later, but it's a pretty broad discovery that we went into and kind of said, okay, how are we going to tackle this? So this kind of goes along with compatibility, right? So wherever you're logging in, now you need to know compatibility with Passwordless standards. So what operating systems support it? Which people have dedicated devices versus shared devices? What browsers actually are supporting WebAuthn? And what percentage of your applications, like web applications or whatever else, also integrate with SSO to really enable that password solution? And I think the bigger part of this, I think that's pretty standard when you're looking at this, but for us was also going to leaders and saying, this is what we're evaluating and looking at. This is what we're trying to improve. What else is on your roadmap for technology that you're bringing in for users to make a better experience for your Wayfarians, your corporate users or whatever. And because in a few areas we found out that we were like, okay, for this one user role or user kind of story, this is really the good solution for them. And then they're coming and bringing a new technology where that solution was not compatible with our passwordless direction. So we really had to make sure we were communicating with leadership to make that we weren't implementing something that was immediately going to be obsolete or lose value. Lastly, I've mentioned speed times, but just the importance of SSO, right? Like really getting the best bang for your buck. One of the easiest things you can do without actually spending really any money is probably just start setting standards if you haven't already on your SSO platform, because there's a really good chance that those are the ones that really that supports what you need to really accelerate your journey, or something you can always switch over to that might better meet your needs. So that's really important to think about, and also set standards early on. So then we have our users, stories, we have our technology stack, we have all the platforms that we're authenticating to, what are our options, and we kind of divided it the way we're thinking into platform authenticators as well as roaming authenticators primarily. So platform authenticators are things that are built into devices or operating systems you're already probably familiar with. Windows Hello for Business, OS X has Touch ID, Chromebooks have built-in security keys if you're not aware of that. And then on the mobile front, iOS and Android both have some form of a fingerprint, so Touch ID or facial recognition authentication. We want to see what within our current capability set could we move to, setting hardware standards, so on, or, without spending too much money, versus, what do we actually have to, go out there and procure? And, there's the other side of it, which is roaming authenticators, right? So, the roaming authenticators are super important for when you have shared devices or users that maybe don't have a dedicated workstation. So, in a Wayfair, there's a number of systems where people don't actually own a laptop because they go in and they kind of sit wherever they need to for that day and then move on, or they might be handed a device when they come in through the door and then hand it back in when they leave, right? So they're not using the same device every day, so you can't really tie that user to that device and enroll their authentication methods. And in those use cases, typically some sort of security key or roaming authenticator is the best option. The last part of evaluation, right? So we knew the types of typical platform authenticators and roaming keys were, but we also started looking at some third-party solutions. I'm not going to recommend any to anybody here, but the important thing is to actually go out and evaluate this stuff for yourself and see what meets your needs, right? So the biggest takeaway that we found through talking with some vendors was that a third-party kind of vendor can work seamlessly across platforms. So if you have that need for that centralization, that user experience to be the same, whether it be Windows, OS X, or mobile, then you might be able to use something that's outside those native platform authenticators for your environment. And they usually use some sort of mobile device that's tied to the user that kind of roams, is like a roaming authenticator for them. And they sometimes offer security key support as well. But yeah, it's definitely something that you should evaluate early as you're looking at the technology strategy in your environment. And then one of the things we realize is, with anything that's authentication, tying any user and, having user information, that we realize that we want to be ahead of the problems, and we recommend that you consider privacy implications of whatever solution you choose. So, one thing that comes to mind that's obvious is biometric is part of those passwordless authentication methods. So you should really work with your legal and data privacy teams to evaluate what privacy laws are applicable to your company and your geolocations that you operate, and if you need to do anything to adhere to those policies. Because the landscape's pretty dynamic and changing. A lot of the protocols and stuff are really good, but it's worth working with your own teams to decide what's best for your organization. And same thing as you change authentication methods, because it's tied to a user, and you're saying I am Mike Virginio to a technology. Anything with tracking or biometrics could potentially be an area where users could have concerns. And so being really transparent about the technology you're rolling out to these end users is we found to be super important. So what we did was we created some articles or guides to help an average user, a non-security person, really understand what is happening and what we're doing and how it authenticates them at a really high level using diagrams and images. Then that helps, we saw that really help drive adoption of the platforms as well. So it kind of plays two roles there. So those are all things we took into the technology side. Next, I'll cover a couple things around defining success and being successful, as well as some of the challenges you should anticipate in your organization. So first, we have an example of security key evaluation criteria. At Wayfair, we use data really to drive our decision making, and so that also comes with like having really clearly defined success criteria in any project we do. So we had different success criteria in different areas on both the user experience side, the technology side, as well as kind of the ongoing cost side. And on the user experience, right, if you're procuring something, potentially like a security key, there's a number of considerations that you might not typically have for like a normal security software. And one of which being, the connectivity options of that security key, right? Are you using wireless things like NFC, Bluetooth? Are you deciding to buy USB-A, USB-C keys, or Lightning? Things that work with your mobile systems. And the other thing of it, if you do use a wireless technology, not all keys are created equal, and not all mobile devices are created equal either. So you have to make sure that your devices work well with the key on a wireless connectivity standpoint. So we found NFC signal strength would be varying across those devices. So you should also make sure those meet your needs and provide a good user experience so that adoption and success is good. Of course, you should check you're procuring keys that match the protocols that you need and actually will be using. So you don't want to be paying for something with all the bells and whistles, but you only are going to be using a subset of those. And that goes along with the certification level. But two really big ones that I think were also unique for this problem was asset management of the keys. There's a lot that goes into the life cycle of providing a user a device, especially one for authentication. How you're going to handle inventory of those, providing them, enrolling them, collecting them if you expect them to be collected back, and then potentially re-enrollment. That's a big challenge, and that's something new. You have to really work cross-functionally across your organization to make it successful. And then there's two options, right? When you're buying the keys, there's usually CapEx. There's more and more subscription models out there. They have different advantages and disadvantages, and we worked really heavily with our procurement team to figure out, what was the best option for Wayfair, long term. Measuring success. So these are some ways that we were showing and advertised, how adoption was going, how time was being saved, some of those key success metrics that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So, both in quantitative and qualitative ways. And so tracking adoption was important, right? We want to make sure that, we did all this research, we did all this effort, and then we're rolling them out. We want to make sure they're actually being enrolled, actually being used. And if they're not being used, trying to figure out why they're not being used. So you should make a dashboard or run reports basically seeing if people, one, are enrolling them, and then two, the number of times they're using them to authenticate. And then with that metric, that information, you can then start tracking additional benefits and ROIs to show the business. So you can talk about things, time saved per authentication and employee, reduction of password and account related issues. And then one way you can do that is work with your service desk. Sometimes they have a cost associated to per ticket entry, or different types of tickets have different costs. So you can kind of talk about volume and cost savings and ticket reduction. So on the right there's just some graphs we put together at a high level that show password resets slowly declining and strong factor usage being increased over time over the same time frame. And then lastly, on the qualitative side, we used net promoter scores and surveys to get both end user feedback for user experience and happiness levels, so to speak, as well as IT feedback and help desk, so IT administrators. And want to make sure that we're really making, obviously security is going to be happy with the option, but there's other stakeholders involved in this, and that they're also, reaping the benefits of our initiative. And then some of the challenges we found along the way, I mentioned, some of these kind of as I've gone through the talk, but I really want to make sure I consolidated them and emphasize them in a central location here. First is, getting that alignment. It seems like a really easy security sell. and it kind of is, but there are people who are resistant potentially, or there are challenges in explaining the benefits to non-security folks who may not be as knowledgeable in these technologies and understand the benefits. So we found that some people like passwords, and we found that to be shocking because my impression my whole life has been that passwords stink and they're hard to use and remember and so on. But it is something that's very familiar. People understand how it works. There's recognized support mechanisms for them that have been used for a long time. So there was some resistance to that type of like change in the environment. And through that, we realized that it became really difficult in some areas to explain the technology differences. So like, how do you explain a FIDO2 authenticator and like an RFID badge, which may use like PIV, easily to the business and say like, well, you could do that, and you've seen maybe a peer in the industry doing that, but that's not as strong or as scalable or as future-proof or whatever it is as this technology. And explaining that difference can get really nuanced. So coming to the table prepared and having those like diagrams and so on ahead of time are really helpful. Next thing, I mentioned at the start, like dishing passwords completely today is really hard. User onboarding. When we first started this, you could not create a user account without a password. I think recently, as maybe a couple of months ago, in March or so, Microsoft provided the option to remove passwords as a requirement when enrolling a new user in Azure. That's, I think, the only instance that I'm aware of where that's the case, and that's still, there might be downstream effects to enrolling a user without a password because there's no fallback recovery workflows and other mechanisms potentially. So that life cycle and management can be challenging. So it's really hard to get rid of passwords 100% in your environment today. And then of course there's legacy apps that might not work with things, don't like SSO and so on. So that's why we kind of went that less passwords goal to at least start the journey. Support for FIDO2. 2018 is drastically different than 2021. I think there's been massive strides this past year, in particular, and maybe end of 2020, for like embedded browser support, mobile apps, and so on. We also noticed there's varying support on the user verification level. It's kind of at a platform or browser discretion to implement or allow the administrator to say, yeah, I want to turn on user verification for something like a security key, which would be like a PIN when you enter and do like WebAuthn and things. So that was an interesting nuance that we didn't expect, because there were flows where we didn't want to use PIN, there's flows where we did, and that came down to the platform. And lastly, I mentioned asset management, just a huge challenge in general. Like you have this huge logistical concern potentially with a security, obtaining the keys, enrolling them, replacing, recovering, re-implementing if that's your choice. That was a huge challenge that warranted a lot of discussions around the org, around the business, wherever we were trying to discuss that. So, come prepared to think about those things. I think that was it. So I'd be happy to take any questions that are in the room or if there's any virtually.
Sorry, Mike, it just took me a second to make my way back to the microphone. Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have any questions in the room before? Okay, we have a question. So in terms of the applications that you've moved over to pure FIDO login, can you share like which applications did you have the best success with in moving, and like any good war stories there? That's a question from Bob Lord. He's here.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think your single sign-on experience is really going to be your web applications. Using WebAuthn is really going to get the best bang for your buck. And that's just because, everyone's, with the pandemic especially, is kind of going cloud native, where they're moving things to their cloud environment, or you're procuring a SaaS service. which it integrates well and easily with that. So it's easy to set policies there, centrally manage things, and then also communicate to users, because you can see which users have access to that application, tell them, they're switching over to this new flow or whatever it might be with how your SSO platform works. I don't think there's any real war stories. I think there was a number of interesting nuances we hit along the way with, some of our warehouse space, because there's, things can be decentralized when you're talking about, operations globally, and there's different technologies that exist there, and things supposed to work and they don't. But nothing comes to mind as a war story, unfortunately.
Thank you. Another question was whether you considered bring your own key for security key support at all.
Yeah, we did talk about that, because, like the people on the security team, like I think I've got 3 keys and probably another 2 within reach. So we all have them. And there's a lot of talk about, mobile devices and what you have today to kind of augment the costs. I think the decision was more to use what we have was more on the OS platform side. I think you can go really far with some built-in capabilities, on your operating system, on the laptops you provide your users. And that's kind of like a bring your own key, right? Because you don't force users to use it. However, you provide it to them, you provide documentation on it, and you don't have to do additional procurement necessarily unless your hardware doesn't meet the correct specs. So I think that's kind of where we ended up settling, rather than we allow people to enroll their own keys, because it's just a protocol and it has to be compliant with the enrollment part of it. But we really wanted to increase and accelerate adoption. So the best way to do that is really to provide something.
All right, thank you. Any other questions before we wrap up? All right, thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you,
Great
appreciate it.
presentation. Thanks.